Right, good afternoon, everybody. It's after 2 o'clock, so I'm opening the meeting now. Welcome, everybody, and Happy New Year. Let's just have some introductions for people who aren't members of the committee. We've got Mr. Wathen on the left and Jonathan Davis from Finance also on the left. We've got Non Jenkins and Terry Lewis from the Welsh Audit Office at the front. I think that's Deb Hill-Howells there on the left at the front. And next to you is... Use the microphone, yeah.
Ben Winstanley, the Estates Manager for Monmouthshire.
Okay, thank you very much. And we've got Annette... sorry, I've missed the name. I've got it somewhere.
Annette Evans.
Annette Evans, yes. Sorry, that's just my memory failing me there. Right. And next to Annette is...
Richard Jones, Policy and Performance Officer.
Fine. Anyone else here that... yes, we've got... yes, introduce yourself.
David Jarrett, Central Finance for Welsh Church Fund.
Thank you very much. And we've just been joined by Leslie Russell from Finance.
Apologies, Chairman, Councillor Val Smith.
Yes. Right, well, you're here, aren't you? Yes, okay. Fine. So we'll start with the formal agenda. Apologies for absence, please.
Apologies for absence from Councillors Sheila Woodhouse and Joe Watkins.
And then we'll go on to declarations of interest, as usual. If people want to make a declaration during the meeting, that's fine with me. Councillor Easton.
There are two items on the agenda which I know I'm declaring on. It's the Scolly School. I'm a governor there, and also I'm a member of the Welsh trustee of the Welsh Church Fund. Sorry, the Mon Farm Trust. Right.
Next item on the agenda is public open forum. I can see no members of the public or press present, so I'll move on. Now, I'm going to take item 11, which is the asset management review, before item 6, as I know that Non Jenkins from the Welsh Audit Office has to get away today. But the first thing I'm going to go on to is the minutes of the meeting, which was held on the 23rd of November. Does anyone have any comments?
Prepared to move them. I was at that one.
Yeah, I just wonder whether anyone does have any comments or observations on the minutes. No, we've got a mover, seconder. Yeah, we've got a seconder, so the minutes have been accepted. Thank you very much. And now on to the action points from the meeting of 23rd of November. The action point says implementation of Audit Committee recommendations. It's actually internal audit recommendations. But the action point was that the Chief Officer from Children and Young Persons should be asked to provide details of measures taken or plans to address audit opinions. Now, we did ask for a report. Is there any news on that, Mr. Wathen?
Chairman, I can give members an update. I've spoken to Will, the Chief Officer of CYP, and he's asked for further information from me, which I need to supply to him. And what he'll need to do is go back to individual schools, head teachers, to find out why the audit recommendations of previous school reports have not been implemented as well as we'd have hoped. This comes from a previous report that was presented to Audit Committee about implementation of audit recommendations, and members were concerned that within CYP there wasn't a great uptake of actual implemented recommendations. So we're on the case with it, Chairman. Apologies for not providing that information today, but we'll make sure it comes next time.
Thank you very much. Yes, Councillor Smith.
Yes, under the agenda item 5, I was wondering, is it proposed that there should be a new form to submit for all contracts with appropriate columns, whether you need to, whether you need an exemption, whether you don't, and the procedure? So you've got a clear account of everything that is embarked on, whether it needs authorisation for a contract. If it doesn't, that's fine. But the piece of paper or the record is there that that individual actually looked at the procedure and said, I don't need to do this, looked at the procedure and said, yes, it is necessary for me to go via this route or this route. Now, we don't seem to have a form that follows that process. I'm very simple, Chairman. You can either tick or you cross.
Well, Councillor Smith, I think that the point you're raising is an appropriate point to raise at this point, especially since we've got an action about contract procedure rules a couple of lines further down. The actual action on the contract procedure rules was that we were considering calling in 3 of the heads of service where the contract procedure rules had apparently not been followed. And I was going to ask Andrew Wathen to provide an update on that, but it looks like there's a supplementary question coming from you. So can we deal with it like that, please? Yes, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine, Chairman. Yeah, okay. I'll respond to the member's question in a second, Chair. In terms of the action plan, members were concerned that following my previous report on contract procedure rules exemptions, there were a couple of gaps in terms of the paperwork that was coming back, and members felt it was appropriate to call in various heads of service and possibly cabinet members to justify why the proper paperwork hadn't been followed. There were 3 in particular which members were concerned about. I've spoken to one individual who said that the form was no longer required and they went through a proper procurement process rather than requiring an exemption. So that negates that particular issue. And the 2 others have been written to, but I haven't yet had a response. So again, I can provide an update at the next Audit Committee. But in the meantime, if members feel it's appropriate to call those particular heads of service in, then that's your prerogative, Chair. In terms of the other question raised by the councillor, the form produced in the report is my log of CPR exemptions. So when managers request an exemption from the normal contract procedure rules, we document it so we can keep a tab on it, we can monitor whether they've been approved appropriately and authorised correctly and therefore follow the right procedure. And that signed form, authorised form, needs to come back to me and my team, and then we report back into Audit Committee. So that's the process. In terms of the specific question, we've got a set of rules, they're called contract procedure rules, specifically within the council, which advises managers of how to procure goods and services. So rather than a specific form, have I complied with this, have I not complied with this, have I followed the right procedure, all managers who are involved in the procurement process are required to follow our CPRs.
My question was prompted, well, my comment was just that sometimes people seem to have forgotten the system exists, and then you have an issue, and that if there's a blanket cover, that everybody knows that procedure and ticks one or other box. But just my... Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, and if I could just add to that, Chairman, what I will do for members is that I'll write out to all managers in due course and remind them of that procedure.
Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And in view of the fact that the managers concerned have not responded to the request from internal audit, I suggest that we do ask them to come along and tell us why. And if they've got a very good reason, well, I'm sure they'll give it, and that will be the end of it. But if they haven't, well, then perhaps we ought to remind them that we're here.
I support that, Chairman. It's not good enough. There's been no response.
Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. I feel this in a similar vein regarding the action point that Mr. Wather mentioned regarding the CYP. It's 23, 34, nearly 50 days, 7 weeks since we requested information off the officer. Yet I understand now that more information is required so the question can be answered. The 33 schools is in Monmouthshire. Our next meeting will be in March. It seems to me that it's unlikely we get the proper information then unless some skates are put on. I think it's inappropriate that we, as an audit committee, we're a strategy committee, we ask proper questions, we ask and expect answers, and I believe that to have waited 7 weeks and then not have enough information. Sorry? Okay, I believe that we should have the information.
Well, my feeling of the mood of the committee at this moment is that we do invite in the head of children and young persons and the two areas which hadn't apparently followed the correct procedure on the contract procedure rules, and Just to remind us what we're talking about something described as Parson Brinkerhoff used as part of a consultancy framework. That's road repairs worth £57,000. An extension to contract with Alan Griffiths for construction work that was £300,000. So we'll invite them to come and answer questions at our next meeting. Councillor.
Yeah, just for the benefit of information shared, as an authority, we're looking very closely at procurement anyway. So this would be a useful addition to that exercise, I think.
Thank you very much. I'll just go back to the second action point, the paper on unsatisfactory audit opinions. That has now been put on the agenda as agenda item 9. And the final one, Curbcraft. There was a request for more information about bicycle and motorcycle training, and a written report was requested. We've actually had something in writing from Geraint Roberts. I just wanted to check whether that was what we were expecting as far as the committee is concerned. Apparently so. It has been made available to members, I believe, although very recently. Right, okay.
Yes, Chair. I only came back from holiday last night, but in my scanning of my emails, there was definitely something from him. So I don't know what it said. I'm not pretending to be that up to date, but yes, there was something.
I'll note that a response was received. Thank you very much. Right, we'll move on then to the next item I wish to take, which is the review of asset management paper, which is number 11 on the agenda. And I'm going to invite Non Jenkins from the Welsh Audit Office to introduce this, please. I will later ask for a response from the authority.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for allowing me and bringing me forward on the agenda, enabling me to get away. I won't spend much time going through this. I'll just briefly take you through the key messages, because obviously you've also got the Council's management response as to what actions they are taking and have taken to date and plan to take in the future. But just to give you some background, in March of 2015, some of you will remember, although not everybody maybe here will remember, we did a corporate assessment for the whole council. So that's an assessment of the council's corporate arrangements that we did at the time. And we did that in 2015. As part of that, we kind of took an overview as to some of the arrangements, which included asset management. And what we've done since is kind of follow up some of the issues that came out in terms of the proposals for improvement that we made at the time, and we followed those through. So we did a review, an update review, follow-on review in 2017, early 2017. And what we did there was basically to ask whether the council had arrangements to manage its assets effectively. So we did more of a deeper dive on this one than we did at the corporate assessment. And our conclusion at the time was that the council had a good understanding of its assets. However, it lacked a strategic approach and effective information technology to support the management of its assets. Now, we came to that conclusion because whilst the council had an asset management plan, it wasn't clear what period that covered. So you agreed it in 2014, but it wasn't clear how long that lasted. And also it only included 1 year of an action plan. So it was only 2015-16 that actually had an action plan. That's not to say that things haven't been happening since, because there is an estate management service plan, but most of the action and the driving forward and the improvement has come through the service plans, but not really clearly linked, I suppose, in that sense to the plan. But that's not what. But the asset management plan itself is part of a number of documents that you have that provide a framework for the way that you manage your assets. And I know as part of your management response that you're reviewing your asset management plan at this point in time. So you've taken that forward already. We also found that you clearly understood your property asset base, so you knew what buildings you had. But at that point in time, when we looked at the work, you hadn't described in your plan what you may have known, but you hadn't described what your long-term service pressures were in terms of that, and I'm sure you'll pick that up as part of your review. You also had, at the time, you did set up an asset management working group in 2014 at the time that you agreed your asset management plan, but you did a review at a certain point, and you felt that that hadn't progressed the way that you had wanted it to. Also, the place board you didn't feel that had got to what you wanted it to get to. But the working group for county farms and your senior leadership team property rationalisation working group was ongoing at the time that we were doing this work. So and I know from your management response that you're looking at the governance arrangements around how do you manage your assets going forward and making sure that they are fit for purpose and are delivering what you need them to do, including the new asset management plan. You did have a good understanding and good links between immediate budget pressures and between your asset management immediate priorities and your budget pressures. So there were good links with finance and your financial plans. And also in terms of your priorities, you linked your priorities for your asset management with your investment plans too. And your savings proposal that did include asset management issues linked to your medium-term financial plan. So there were links in terms of finance with immediate priorities and priorities and improvements, I suppose, in that sense. But again, it's the longer term, it's seeing that through the longer term. But you hadn't clearly assessed the user needs for your council buildings or other properties that you had in terms of longer term. And although that's not to say, because you had done a lot of public engagement work, but you weren't necessarily using that information to inform the decision making and the planning around asset management at the time. So it's not that you're not doing it, it's basically trying to knit it better together is the point that we're making. So we also concluded that the council showed an improvement in the way that you manage some of your assets, but the management arrangements weren't as coordinated as they could be and weren't necessarily supported with effective IT systems. So, for example, when you're in the relocation programme that you had here for relocating to Usk, People's Strategy said one things and committed you to one things, but the action plans through the property rationalisation working group were underdeveloped, didn't really cover everything that you needed to as part of that location. So basically, the key message there is better project management, really, going forward on major projects in that sense, and making sure that everything ties up again. In terms of your community asset transfer policies and the activities that were being undertaken during 16-17, you were providing better guidance at that point, and that was being prepared. So I'm assuming that's completed and out now. But you had raised a risk around capacity to deliver your asset management arrangements and plans, and also in making sure that all of the different departments and services were actually working together rather than working separately on this. Again, knitting and tying it together better is the key message. But we did find that your IT systems were poorly integrated. That wasn't something that probably helped you or enabled you to take this forward as fast as you wanted to. So I know that you've got that reviewed, but so getting those enabling services in place to help you drive this forward is key. At the time of our review, they weren't well integrated. And then our third conclusion is around how do you review your asset management plan. So we've talked about the plan, we've talked about how you deliver the plan, and now this is a conclusion around how you review the plan. And I suppose the key message here is a simple one, really, in that you agreed your asset management plan in 2014. You committed to doing an annual review of it, but it hasn't happened annually. So it's about making sure that you're following up on monitoring things. That's not to say that the service plan isn't, but again, it's how do you keep that all ticking together and rolling forward, and really, making sure that you're reviewing and making sure that it's up to date. Is our key point there. So we've made one proposal for improvement for you, which I'll leave the officers to go through because they've responded to that as a response to you as a committee. Any questions? Happy to answer or take back if I can't answer.
Well, we'll just go to Mrs. Hill-Howells first, I think, to give the management response or tell us what she wants us to know about the management response, and then I'll throw it open to comments and questions.
Thank you very much. I think, as Non-Jenkins has actually explained, you came in beginning of April last year. At that point, we were just before an election. So whilst the asset management plan had been adopted in November 2014, we weren't going to review the asset management plan until the new regime was in place, because obviously our strategies follow the strategies of whoever has been elected at a particular point in time. We recognise it needed to be reviewed, and we are reviewing it. The strategy has been in draft for a while. What we are waiting to do now is to follow it based on the corporate plan, and that corporate plan is being drafted based on the priorities that the incumbent administration are now dictating. We recognise that the strategy and the plan need to be separate, and in the new draft there will be a strategy that will encompass the 5-year duration of the political administration, and then there will be an action plan that will be reviewed. The action plan is already embedded in the estate's service improvement plan, so we do review it, but I take completely that wasn't articulated as effectively as it could have been, albeit that was reviewed through scrutiny and strong communities, etc. So our plans were being reviewed. So we've accepted that we need to review the strategy. The performance indicators we've already reviewed. They're in line with the service improvement plan, then they will form what comes out in the new strategy. In terms of governance arrangements, the place board has already been reconstituted. I don't accept that our project management arrangements are weak. We've just delivered on our accommodation worker group strategy. We delivered E-block on time in budget. We're now working on J-block. I think we do have strong project management in place, albeit again, perhaps it's not as visible as perhaps it needs to be. The governance in terms of an asset management steering group going forward, you're quite right, it didn't deliver what it needed to do. I've been discussing with Mark Howcroft. Actually, rather than having a separate capital working group and an asset management strategy group, because they are so intertwined and embedded, whether we actually have one group going forward where we can consider property and finance at the same time, and that's probably our preferred strategy, with working groups below, like the accommodation working group that we have now. So those discussions are ongoing. You'll see in the plan that we've said by April of this year that will be in place. As we've said, the new strategy will be in place. In terms of the IT asset management system, I can't disagree with anything that the report said. We have specific issues with that existing IT system. It's a legacy system that's been in place for in excess of 10 years. We have specific issues with finance around asset valuations and reporting, in that our system doesn't talk to finance, so we have to put information together via spreadsheets. And again, we're looking at a provision or a new system that will actually work across the services so that we can improve efficiency for both areas. So we are looking at that at the moment. In terms of the other two actions, if you bear with me, utilising information, I think we do. I think if you look at the Abergavenny Hub reports, and I think if you look at the ESC Hub reports, you'll see that actually the consultation is well documented through those, and through the creation of the community hubs per se, that service. All of the consultation that we did around the property aspects were included in our reports. So we do learn from it. I think the lens on this was particularly around community asset transfer. At the time of the audit, we had only actually undertaken 2, I believe, at that point. We had actually created our policy in advance of the best guidance coming out from Wales. So it's always a learning curve when you're doing something that's new, and we will continue to make sure that we do articulate the learning that we get from our consultation and embed it in any reports going forward. That said, we are continually reviewing the strategy around that and looking at how we can improve it for users of that service, which at the moment is in rewriting our protocols to include now a business plan to make it easier for them with a template. Okay.
Thank you. Any questions or observations? Councillor Murphy.
I think the main observation, Chair, is something that we ought to be quite pleased about with regard to progress. When Non and her team looked at this, we had two separate departments that didn't really work together very well. Deb's new role as corporate landlord encompasses both of those departments, so we have actually pulled all of the control together in one job. And as I say, that's the job that Deb holds. So we've taken quite strong management decisions to enable us to get that control together, and we're already seeing the benefit of that.
Thank you. Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. It's quite a strong report and quite a strong rebuttal from the Monmouthshire officers. I do have some questions regarding paragraph 34 and 35, which is realisation of assets, particularly in the county farms area, where there seems to be some looseness in the collection of arrears and moving of properties, realising assets from them. But from the response we've had from the officers, I think maybe my thoughts is that in maybe 6 or 8 months' time, they can come back to us with where they've gone from the report to where they are now to where they could be in some time, because you could tease out why this hadn't been done or why that hasn't been done. Why did we wait a year before we got 1.7 million back, things like that. Perhaps the recommendations from the Wales Audit Office might help to answer those questions in a few months' time.
Thank you. Are there any plans to provide a further update, say in about 9 months?
Well, I could give you an update now, actually, if that's helpful. In terms of county farms, we commissioned a report, an external report, to see how we could actually review the strategy on that, how we can maximise income on the rental streams that we're already getting, where there are opportunities to generate additional income through diversification, glamping, whatever else. That was drafted. It's been out to consultation with our tenants. We're expecting to have the summary of that consultation back with us in the next week or so. And we'll be looking then to come back to members to implement that strategy. In terms of debt collection and generating income, we're not slow in trying to recover debt. Our rent arrears are relatively low, bearing in mind we're in an agricultural area, and we've had issues around things like dairy. The milk, when the milk prices dropped, we have to be a responsible landlord. We need to put arrangements in place so that we don't put people out of business, but we still recover our debt. We also have an issue, unfortunately, legacy around water arrears, in that when properties have previously been sold, at that point they weren't required to put in their own water network, which means they still draw their water supplies from us, which we then have to invoice back out to essentially private occupiers of residential dwellings. They are the most difficult people sometimes to actually realise their income from. We're unable to put any enforcement action because we can't cut off their water supplies. And whilst we chase and chase and chase, our legal options are really limited in terms of water arrears. And I think you'll find that's where most of our arrears now sit in terms of the county farms portfolio.
This question of water and water rates and distribution came, I think, before this committee some 12, 18 months, 2 years ago. And I think a recommendation, if I remember rightly, was that we should ensure, or go down the route of trying to ensure, that each of these properties had their own water meter so that we could accurately collect from them. Because yes, there was a problem of drawing water off which wasn't really metered.
And what we've actually recently done in the last 18 months, 2 years, was actually implement a smart metering system. Previously, it was a manual task where a number of officers had to go 2 or 3 times a year, and they'd actually physically lift manholes to take manual meter readings. We did away with that by putting in the smart meters, which allows us to collect that information digitally. I was under the impression they weren't even metered, but they are metered. They've always been metered. They have sub-meters in it. Our issue is not the metering or the accurate recording of water usage. Our issue is extracting the money from the people who've actually used that water.
Yeah, we all supported, yeah.
I think there was a comment from Mr. Jones, yes?
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the original point around monitoring arrangements, particularly for the proposals coming out of the report, just sort of be useful to remind the committee that you receive a 6-monthly report of all the proposals that have been issued by Wales Audit Office that are considered still to be open. So that's where we've still got action to undertake. And then that's coming forward to your next meeting in March and sequentially comes every 6 months. So in terms of the specific proposals, the action plan that's been established by the team will be updated and reviewed every 6 months. And the update brought back to this committee for review.
The assets report will be included in that list of things to be reported back. Okay. Councillor Murphy?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I just come back to the County Farms issue and the review being carried out by Knight Frank? It's a very, very comprehensive look at what we're doing with County Farms. But if I can link that into what Non was talking about, it's not just looking at County Farms as a single item. It's, are we getting the right rent? Are we got the right use for it? Are they the right size? How do they integrate with all the other policies? It's a major review. I've had a couple of meetings with them, so have other cabinet members. You know, the report when it comes will be really comprehensive. So I think that's an example of us trying to tie things together and get a better outcome as a result. So there's a lot going on with that.
Okay, so we've had the WAO report and the management response. We know it's going to be followed up as part of the way we follow up WAO recommendations in future reports. If the committee is satisfied. Councillor Smith.
Really simple question. Why can't the farms be on main supply? I know that when the supply comes to the edge of your property, then you're responsible for your own leaks on my patch. So why can't we just shift the problem?
It's a very straightforward response. Welsh Water won't adopt them. It's quite a vast network, and we have repeatedly asked Welsh Water to look at it, to adopt it, to get it back onto the mains. But it's huge. It's basically the whole of Saint-Pierre right the way down to and they just say that the sheer size of it is not something that they'd look to take on, because they'd have to run all new infrastructure right up, and we've tried.
So if the committee is satisfied with the information that we have, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next agenda item. Which is the Whole Authority Customer Feedback and Freedom of Information Act report from Annette Evans, who is coming down to introduce the report. I'll just note that the recommendation in the paper is that we should note the report. Remember to use the microphone.
Yeah, I have. I've got it on.
Can you press the button again to see if you can get the camera around? There we go.
Okay. Right, okay then. So this is the Whole Authority Complaints, Compliments and Comments report. It's for your information. It just tells you about the activity with regards to that. And also some information about freedom of information, the statistics there, because my team deal with the freedom of information requests that we get. So for those of you who are not familiar with the complaints policy, the Whole Authority complaints procedure, we follow the Ombudsman's model. That's the Public Services Ombudsman for Wales. He's asked all the local authorities in Wales to follow a particular model where we have two stages to the complaints procedure. And that's the first stage is the informal resolution, where the majority of complaints are resolved. And then the second stage is where people are not happy and they want to take their complaint further. And at that point, then I appoint an investigating officer, someone from outside of the service being complained about, to investigate the complaint and produce a report on their findings about the matter. And then that goes to the head of service, and the head of service then responds to the complainant, addressing the findings and recommendations made in the report. So as you can see, for this period, 2016-17, there were 85 complaints. And of the 85 complaints, 79 of them were dealt with at the informal resolution stage. Out of the 79, four complainants weren't satisfied at stage 1, and therefore they requested that their complaint be investigated at the formal investigation. There were then 6 complaints because under the procedure, people have the right to go directly to the formal stage if they wish. And there were 6 complainants that wished to take their complaint directly to stage 2. If they still are not happy, they can go to the Ombudsman, the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales, and they will consider whether they will investigate their complaint further. They will generally ask us for a copy of our report, and then they will base they will decide then whether they carry out their own investigation or they are satisfied with what we've done. So the services that are most complained about, you can see there, I'm not going to go through them all, but you know, it's about recycling and waste, highways, passenger transport, planning, estates, and I've given you some examples there of the type of complaints that I get and where we get the most complaints. You know, waste and recycling, missed bins, food waste collections, they're always top of the pile. Lack of maintenance, highways, you know, we get, depending on the time of year, in the winter it's about potholes and the grit bins. In the summer it could be, you know, cutting of hedges, etc. You'll see passenger transport there. We've had some issues, people not happy with the bus timetables, the alleged poor school transport. So there's been some issues with regard to passenger transport. Planning, development control. We often get complaints. People can't complain about the decision that's been made around a planning application, but they can complain about the process. So often if they complain, it's generally about the process. And we've had some issues around estates as well. So they are sort of the main sort of areas where we've had complaints. And then under others, you know, it's where sort of staff conduct is issues with the public toilets in Abergavenny. So there's a number of services there that I haven't been able to put to a directorate, as it were. And then you will see then that the stage 2 complaints, I've given you some examples there of the stage 2 complaints that went to the formal investigation. And you'll note as well that the whole authority complaints procedure doesn't deal with social services complaints. We have a separate complaints process for social services. And you'll note that for social services there were 63 complaints, 81 comments and 118 compliments about that service. With regard to the whole authority complaints process, the timescales for dealing with complaints, we've got 10 working days for stage 1s, because what we try to do is to get in there and respond quickly to people's issues. And then if they're not happy, when it comes to stage 2 is 20 working days, and that's after the complainant has agreed what the complaint is about. And then the head of service then would have 10 working days in order to respond to the complainant. You'll see that we had 153 comments. Now, with the comments, very often it's people who just want to raise a concern. They don't want to go through a formal process, but they want an answer to whatever their issue is. So we log these as well. And in a similar way, as I deal with complaints, I would go to the relevant manager and ask them to respond to the person raising the issue and ask them to get back to them. So there's sort of a table there of where we've had those comments and people perhaps not satisfied with various things. Again, I've given you a selection of comments that we've received. With regards to the registrar section and building control, they actually send out questionnaires after they've completed their job. So therefore, we have had a lot of responses back from those particular services. And I think that's why we've had an increase in the amount of compliments that we've received. I've gone on then to say then about some other types of comments that we've had. Council tax, we often have issues about council tax. Again, development control. There were some issues about the website. People had issues, with paying bills, and some people felt it wasn't user-friendly, etc. Leisure, there were some issues there that you'll see. Swimming timetables, can't get to the equipment in the gym, etc. So issues there. Parking, this often comes up, people receiving a parking penalty charge notice, and they think that perhaps it's unfair for whatever reason. The contact centres, some people weren't happy that they felt they were waiting a long time. And then we always have, under the operations directorate, there's always, a number of different things there: street lighting, the potholes, the state of the roads, overgrown grass, etc., etc. And then we come on to the compliments, and there was an increase in the amount of compliments. And I think, as I've just said, I think it's because of those questionnaires that are sent out. But nevertheless, it is nice that people do take the time to contact us and thank us if they feel that our staff have done a good job. So that's good to receive. Sometimes people come to us, they think it's a complaint, but perhaps they haven't they haven't made a request previously, so it's a request for service. So if we get those, we send them on to the relevant directorate and ask that they deal with it as a request for service. So as our complaints were down slightly on last year, but our stage 2 complaints were up. So we didn't seem to satisfy people at that informal stage as well as we had the previous year. With complaints, all the time what we're trying to do is learn from complaints and improve practice wherever we can. And what we do after any complaints investigation, we always have an action plan, and whatever recommendations come out of a formal investigation, we put in that action plan, and then that goes to the relevant manager, service manager, head of service, to make sure that we do follow up on carrying out those recommendations that were made. And I've listed there for you some issues that came up in the formal complaints and in the recommendations, and we are working on addressing those. So I think that's it on the complaint side of it. As I said, you know, we deal with FOIs as well, freedom of information requests, and they continue to grow since they came into being in January 2005. However, saying that, for this period, they were down slightly on what they were last year. But, you know, for 2016-17, we still received 1,045 requests, and we closed 1,055 requests, and we did that within a 97% time frame. So I've sort of listed there, you know, the directorates where the requests are sort of aimed at, and the sort of common sources where we feel, because with FOIs, you know, they can say Joe Bloggs, you know, they can email in and say Joe Bloggs wants to make this request, so we don't know. But from reading the information, you know, we try and work out where the sources have come from. And a lot of it is commercial, the press, campaigners, political researchers, etc. And, you know, the most common subjects that are information requested about is usually social care, council tax, HR, education matters, etc. So that's where we get most of our requests about. We've got an internal target of responding because we, under the FOI Act, we have to respond within 20 working days. And we've got a target of responding within 90% of the time. So we've achieved that. So that just gives you a flavour of the freedom of information requests that we've received. So there we go. Anybody got any questions?
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions or observations from members of the committee? Councillor Smith.
Reading your report, Jeanette, there's quite a lot of reference or a sort of a theme running through. Communication is not very good. Responses are not very good. Source of great irritation to folks.
Yes.
The other thing that's intriguing, people have said to me, well, I've complained, Val, and they've done nothing. Is it a requirement that if you wish to make a complaint, to actually make a formal complaint, you must say, I wish to make a formal complaint?
Well,
or else I ring up and I'm complaining about something, but it doesn't really go anywhere because I haven't used the magic word.
Yeah.
So is that a truism?
Well, they shouldn't have to use that magic word of a formal complaint. If they're saying that they've got a concern, an issue, it should be addressed. But, you know, if they really want to make sure that the complaint is dealt with, that they come to me, it's just me and a support worker, and that we will make sure that complaint is registered. But strictly speaking, if they make a complaint to the service, they should address that complaint.
The service should address that.
The service should address the complaint, and they should let me know that they've had the complaint.
They should, because perhaps one area that does seem quite low, really, is the highways one. And the other one that did intrigue me, the interstate deaths and public health funerals, that seemed quite a high number. It's gone down from the 5% to 3%. But I just thought, gosh, that's a strange issue.
Yeah, we tend not to give so much information now about public health because there's, I don't know whether you've seen on the television, there's this programme, Hair Hunters, something like that it's called. And we've had legal advice to say that we shouldn't be providing the information because it could pose a risk to families, etc., if they go trying to find out more information about people who have died intestate. So, yeah.
Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. Well, a lot of these complaints come to me normally through my normal emails. But one which does concern me, and I'm a bit worried about it, is on transport. The complaint was children not allowed on school bus with no bus pass. Don't we have a policy for helping children in that sort of circumstance? For example, why didn't they have the bus pass? Couldn't they got on the bus, or were they allowed on the bus? What was the follow-up to that? Because we've got to be very careful with safeguarding with children. Just to say not allowed on the bus with no bus pass says to me something's gone wrong somewhere.
I think that was one where it was right at the start of the term, and where they just sorting out the bus passes, etc. And because they had so many children that had bus passes, and I think the bus was full, there was the health and safety reasons as well. So as much as the passenger transport section don't want children stranded, I think it was all down to that, really. But yes, I mean, it was resolved. I spoke to Richard Cope and the team about it. So, but yeah, it was right at the very beginning when they were trying to sort out the bus passes, etc.
So was it resolved immediately? The child wasn't left stranded? That's what concerns me.
Well, I don't know in this particular one, but I do know that there has been occasions when a child has been left stranded. Yeah, that has happened. But I don't know whether it was that particular one. I'd have to check on that. But yes, but we have addressed that with the team.
Could we ensure, under safeguarding, that we don't leave children standing on the road without an adult? I'm a bit concerned about that one, quite honestly. It does ring bells with me.
Yeah.
Particularly as we've had criticism of the council for, what was the one about crossing the roads and not what? Curbcraft. I think we've got to be very careful on matters like that.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further comments or observations, the committee notes the report, and I'll move on to the next item on the agenda. Thank you, Annette. I'll move on to the next item on the agenda, a Treasury Management Policy Statement from Leslie Russell and/or Jonathan Davis. So I'll hand over to you to introduce it, Leslie.
Good afternoon. I'm going to just give you a brief summary of the Treasury Management document that you've got before you. It's a combined Treasury Management Policy Statement, Strategy Statement, including a minimum revenue provision statement, investment strategy, and also prudential indicators. The overall purpose is to set out policies and strategies which cover investing and borrowing activities. It's also to set out a minimum revenue provision policy and to show provisional prudential indicators. The purpose of this is to minimise risks such as credit risk, which is the loss of the principal, interest rate risk and inflation risk when we're making investments and taking out borrowing. Doing this helps the authority to keep its money, or the money of the public, safe while still achieving acceptable returns and also maintaining liquidity to meet the daily needs, paying salaries and such like. The strategy has been built up based on the draft Capital 18-19 medium-term financial plan and also the revenue medium-term financial plan. Although at the time that I prepared the strategy, some borrowing projects hadn't yet been included, but I have made allowance for those, some borrowing funded projects, but I've made allowance for those when setting the operating limit and authorised limit for borrowing, although that doesn't constitute approval for those projects where they haven't yet been formally approved. Risks, financial risks, have been fairly stable over the last year. So the borrowing and investment strategies have not changed a great deal from the 17-18 strategy. We still, in the main, have a 2 million upper limit for any particular investment deal, and mostly we'll only lend money to counterparties that have a credit rating A- or above. We've just today completed the opt-up process under the MiFID II regulations, so we're now professional status with regards to the financial institutions we deal with. This in turn means that we have to keep 10 million of cash balances, as we call them, for most days during the year. And so that means we may actually be incurring a small amount of borrowing which we wouldn't otherwise have done in order to maintain that limit. But that was one of the requirements to meeting professional status. So what we'll be doing over the next month or so is looking at the way of optimising those small amount of additional investments. We're sort of talking about 2 or 3 million average for the year. So we get a good return on those, and so can at least offset the cost of any additional borrowing. Our financial advisors, that's Arlene Close, have recommended in the sort of recent months to reduce the duration of our investments slightly. This is because some of the big banks, as you're probably aware, are separating into retail and investment banks. And because they're not quite sure which parts of the banks are going into which of the new splits, it's difficult to say exactly which of those banks are likely to be more or less risky. But the advice generally is that we think that there won't be a hugely different risk in either bank, whichever one we ended up in. A couple of other key things. Some of the prudential and treasury indicators are set so that we keep our debt, the debt that the authority has, roughly 50-50 short-term and variable rate versus long-term fixed rate. The long-term fixed rate debt gives you a sort of a security of interest costs going forward, but the variable and short-term debt tends to give you lower interest payments, so it's a balance between the two. We will probably be taking out a small amount of long-term debt in 18-19, but we'll be keeping it fairly short long-term debt, so that's sort of 5 to 10 years rather than longer, again to reduce interest costs. The effects of the strategy are already built into the draft revenue MTFP for 18-19. So providing that MTFP is approved, we will have sufficient budget to cover the interest costs of borrowing. Finally, we mentioned at the last committee that the Prudential and Treasury codes were being reissued. They were reissued just before Christmas, and I've seen them since I have been back after Christmas. And I'll be having a more detailed look at that to see what we need to do sort of going forward. I don't anticipate any difficult decisions. I think it seems to be mainly about ensuring that, or showing that we actually knit together our strategies, such as is the capital programme affordable, and how can we show that, and does it integrate with other things that we're doing. I can either leave it there, or I could just say a few words about Table 1 and the liability benchmark. I don't know, Chairman, whether you think that might be useful.
I think you should, finish what you want to tell us.
If you look at Table 1, I just wanted to say a few words here to explain it, because I know it's not the easiest table to understand. Oh, apparently it's in page 41 on your pack. The capital financing requirement is a number that represents the amount of capital that we have spent in the past and which hasn't yet been financed. So at the end of 18-19, we're anticipating that is 155 million. The other debt liabilities are small, but so the main capital finance requirement is 155, 154. By the end of 18-19, debt that we currently hold now will have reduced to 75 million, because we have quite a bit of short-term borrowing now, which will have matured by then. So if you take the capital financing requirement and you take off the borrowing that we already have taken out and that we'll still hold, there's a borrowing requirement of 79 million after that. Because of internal cash flows, sometimes based on reserves and sometimes just based on working capital, we don't need to borrow the full 79. So that's reduced by the 14 and the 9. So we will need to borrow another 56 million between now and the end of 18-19. Some of that is just replacing short-term borrowing that we currently have, and some of it will be new longer-term borrowing or new shorter-term borrowing. So I just wanted to explain that a little bit. And then if you turn on to the next page, the graph is really showing you those numbers over a very long time scale. So the top line is the loan CFR, is the CFR we just talked about, capital financing requirement. The other line, the lower line, is the amount of is the equivalent to the 75 million. The 79 million. So that's the amount of debt that we would need to take out to cover the borrowing that we've already incurred for previous year's capital programmes. Then all the 4 blocks at the bottom are the borrowing that we currently have, and the reason that that is going down is obviously because some of those borrowing types are maturing. So you can see there's a gap there between that middle line and the block, and that represents the amount of borrowing we'll need to take out. It's not cumulative, it's just so at any particular year there'll be a need for additional borrowing compared to what we have now. And that's quite useful because it helps me see that we need almost as much borrowing in 2042 as we do now. So one answer would be to take out long-term borrowing for sort of 30, 40 years, but that would be quite expensive. So we're not doing that. We're going for staying with the short-term borrowing. So I think that's all I think I could need to say at the beginning. So any questions?
I think Jonathan Davis just wants to add something.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to point out really that we should probably revisit the recommendation for this committee, which was to, I guess, endorse the strategies and statements that will go forward and will be ratified by full council at its March meeting. So I think we just need to be clear that that's the role of the Audit Committee today.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I was just about to say, without reading out the recommendations, which are in the paper in front of you, I will note that the paper, or at least the items at 2.1, are to be ratified by full council. So it implies the authors are seeking endorsement from the Audit Committee for the paper. So, questions and observations, please. Councillor Rees.
I'll try. This is not a question for a quiz night, that's for sure. I don't fully understand it, to be quite honest. I'm trying to tease my way through it. You're saying that your borrowing last year was 90 odd million. This year is going to be 120 million. Next year, 140 million. How long can we sustain a level of borrowing if we're not paying that borrowing back in the right time? In other words, will the interest being paid on that ever put us in a position of bankruptcy, for example? That's the sort of word I can think of. That's my only understanding of what I can read in these papers, is that our borrowing is going up and up and up, but we don't seem to be realising what we should be realising, and that is a reduction in overall debt. Am I making sense?
Yes, that's fine. So at the bottom of table 1, the borrowing requirement goes up. It seems to be going up continuously. A lot of that is because we've had a fairly heavy capital programme, some borrowing on because of the 21st century schools. If once that programme had expired, we reverted to quite a low level of capital expenditure, then the borrowing requirement would come down. And that's reflected by the graph where that middle line is slowly reducing. That's a red line. I must admit, I've got a black and white copy, so it's the middle line, whichever one that is. The red one. So it does depend on what is approved going forward. So if other large capital programmes come along and it's funded by borrowing, then it will bring that line back up again. In terms of whether it's affordable, it's really how much revenue budget the council and all the members can feel that we can continue afford to pay for. As I said before, in the revenue MTFP, we have built in what we need to sustain the programmes that have already been approved. But obviously, if new schemes are approved going forward, then that will change.
Well, the revenue's fine. Well, not fine. The revenue I understand. But in the capital side of things, somewhere along the line, our capital assets are going to won't be there. We'll have run out of capital assets. So somewhere along the line, the fact that we're reducing capital assets and not realising what we would realise, somewhere along the line, we hit the buffers.
Right. I'm not the right person to really answer when our assets will run out, but we do have quite a lot of assets. It's just difficult to realising them. I mean, Ben and Deb would be much better to answer. Yeah.
I think Councillor Murphy's got a contribution here.
Yeah.
Yeah, all I was going to say, Chair, is yes, we are getting rid of as many assets as we can to get in as much money as we can. But of course, we've got, soon we'll have 3 very expensive schools that we will have as assets that will be the product of that exercise. So, we are still having a substantial amount of asset value to back up the borrowing, but because I think we're still working on 60-odd thousand a million, thereabouts.
Yeah, something.
Because it'll have altered a bit with the interest rate charge, won't it?
Yes.
So, but it's between 60 and 70,000 a million is the 25-year borrowing cost, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
And of course we chop it and change that to get the advantage of the best rates when we can get them. And I know we do internal borrowing, and your section for the global thing tends to make quite a substantial contribution to the budget anyway.
Yes.
Service costs tend to escalate, but an awful lot of that's taken away by the amount of money which is earned by the Treasury section. So we're watching that all of the time. And yes, we have got a lot of borrowing at the moment, but we've got 3 soon we'll have 3 very expensive schools on the programme.
So you mean that the band B? I assume you're talking about the. Yeah. So I mean, how we finance those schools is obviously a decision that the whole council has to make. And if Ben and his team, Ben and Deb and the teams can realise some more income from assets, then that would make that programme much easier to afford. But you are right, Councillor Eason, that of course we are whittling down our assets, and I don't know if anyone has any answers to that. So it's it's just so we're doing what we can and what we believe as a council is most sensible at this time.
But the point is, if I can just interject that there, Chair, we can't have one without the other. We're not getting capital grants from Welsh Government. So if we want these new schools and we want all the other improvements around the county, we have a stark choice. We can either do absolutely nothing and hang on to the assets, which will continue to cost us money because they're deteriorating, or we can do something with it.
I made a similar inquiry about whether this was all sustainable, and I was assured that as far as can be foreseen within the financial planning you have, then the repayments on these debts are already budgeted in. So, in a sense, it's not the bank account isn't empty just yet. That the funds are there to pay for the loans.
Yeah, that's correct. As far as the draft MTFP goes, yeah.
Councillor Smith.
There's a reference to the non-treasury investments. Tony raising a point about sort of expenditure. It's a really encouraging drop, the capital one, isn't it? From 17-18, which is looking at 48 million, and then you reckon down to 21-22, 6 million. So that's very encouraging. The purchase of property for investment, non-treasury investments on page 49, that rather intrigued me. It's not covered by the SIPFA code or the WG guidance. The authority may also purchase property for investment purposes. I was surprised to see that comment because I'd read somewhere there had recently been a criticism of some very enterprising councils buying shopping centres and such like. Now, I couldn't imagine we were doing anything like that, but the fact that it was actually included in this statement, why?
I think the main reason that's included in the statement is because I spoke to you earlier about the revised 2017 Prudential Code and Treasury Code. In there, it does actually say that going forward, non-treasury investments should be covered by this strategy. Not monetarily, but in terms of the care with which we take them out. So we continually talk about the security of capital when we're talking about cash investments and making sure we don't lend money to counterparties that are not reliable. And you know, we are, I mean, some councils are much more prudent than we are, but I think you know, we are still very prudent with that money. We don't put it in risky places. And it's just saying, are we carrying that same philosophy forward to purchasing assets for investment purposes? I mean, again, I don't know the detail of it, but Ben and Deb, another hand going up.
Councillor Murphy.
Yeah, if I can help out there, Leslie. You're absolutely right, Val. We have been looking at shopping centres and office blocks, and we're not going for any of them because that doesn't mean to say we won't. But it's just no. It's just that the deals haven't been safe enough. But
that's the criticism in the report that I read.
It was, but some people have caught a cold. We're not going to do that, but. I think it's probably better to sum it up by saying if the right investment came along that could contribute to the income of the council, we would come to members for permission to do it.
Yeah. Councillor Smith, if you obviously know about the solar farm, I mean in essence we did that for the income.
And we're looking at the next one for the income too.
I would have learned by the process we went through for the first one now, Phil.
Yeah, absolutely. It's doing incredibly well.
I do keep reminding Ben to only go for safe property investments.
Thank you.
I'm sure the committee would endorse the concept of safe investments, yes.
If you fancy a wind farm in Northern Ireland, it's one of those.
Okay, well, I think we can say then that the committee has looked at this, and we know that the report will be passed on to full council. So thank you very much, everybody. The next item on the agenda is again for finance, the 2017 reserve usage forecast, possibly going to be Jonathan Davis this time. And the purpose is to appraise audit members of the prospective reserve usage in conjunction with a continued need to highlight the revised reserves protocol endorsed by Cabinet. So I'll just hand over to Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chair. This committee will probably remember the last update on reserves, which was given at its September meeting. And this report updates that position based on any changes in the forecast usage in those reserves during that time. The usage shown in this report is based on the month 7 budget monitoring information. So members are likely to be familiar with the figures quoted in the report, notably under paragraph 3.1, where the movement in the council fund is shown as £62,000 and school balance is £823,000. The key points in the report are really highlighted in paragraphs 3.3 and 5.1. 3.3 stating that earmarked reserves are expected to fall from 6.3 million down to 5.2 million over the MTFP window. And in paragraph 5.1 that as a prudent financial planning assumption, the level of council fund reserves should be between 4 to 6% of net expenditure. The current level is still maintained at 5.05%, which is towards the middle of acceptable levels. The overall conclusion, I think, from this report is that there hasn't been a lot of movement since Q1, but we do still need to keep an eye on the reserve levels as we move towards year end, especially with the pressures on the revenue budget. At that point, I'm happy to take any questions, Chair. Thank you.
I'll hand it over to questions and observations. Councillor Higginson.
Yes, just an observation, Mr. Chairman. I mean, we've heard we've heard it continually over the years, and it's how it is that the reserve levels are in the region of the 5%, and which is considered to be okay, low but prudent, and that's how this council has operated all these years. And there's nothing new in it, really, not as far as I can see.
Councillor Murphy.
We do, just to add to what Jonathan said, we do try, whenever we manage to get a surplus out of the budget, to replenish reserves with it. There's always a temptation to spend it, but certainly last year's 800,000 went straight back into reserves. I wouldn't hold my breath for this year.
Councillor Easton.
Thank you. School reserves, the overall picture is for all the schools in Monmouthshire. But by the end of this financial year, there's likely to be half a million pounds worth of okay? There's likely to be £500,000 worth of deficit on all the schools across Monmouthshire. But if you look at each school across the piece, some are running a reasonable surplus and some are running a fair old deficit. School governors control budgets, but ultimately the council controls the schools in that respect. Where is the end game for schools in terms of where we go to maintain a school in a surplus position rather than a massive deficit position? Because we're going down and down and down. It's going to be total deficit this year, but not for some schools.
Do you want me to do that, Chair?
I'm happy for Councillor Murphy to supply any information he may have.
The breakdown, if you take it very wide.
Councillor, I think your microphone might not be
on.
on.
Sorry. The breakdown, if you'll take it very wide, because I haven't got the figures in front of me, is that as a general rule, primary schools have got reserves, and the secondary schools are the ones that have got the large deficits. With the exception of Caldicott, which is holding up very well, and Chepstow, which is now coming in to a surplus position, having been some 400,000 adrift only a year or two, but we've had reports here. There are recovery plans in place in Monmouth and King Henry at the moment. And there's a small team of us that I'm heading, which is looking very, very closely at those and working with the schools. Normally, if a school has a deficit position, it's got 3 years to get itself right. In cases where we can see it's justified, we'll give them 5 years to do it. But in terms of the resultant school balances position, those schools coming out of deficit will have a dramatic effect on the overall figure, which is what you always see reported. So if you split it up, there's pretty healthy surpluses with regards to the primary sector. It's the secondaries where we had specific problems which are being addressed that is skewing it and making it look worse overall than it actually is on an individual basis.
Thank you for that. Well, if there are no further comments, Councillor Smith.
I was looking at the chart of summary earmarked reserves and looking at April 17 to March 18. And there's a couple of holding their own, but it really shows where the money's going, doesn't it? Or where it's going down. Because I've a little question mark on one side. Investor redesign, IT transformation, and the other was priority investment. Priority investments as to sort of what exactly those contain. So sometime I just ferret that one round. Looking at the restricted use reserves, you've got the outdoor education centre that's had to bring in additional funding, hasn't it? But some of those are really big sums of money, and I just as a member question sort of, well, a simple breakdown for me would be very useful as to, priority investments, IT transformation. I never understand IT, so that's it. And investor redesign. That's a big budget, a big reserve there. And just what happens? So, comment, Chairman. It's a big business, Monmouthshire. I don't understand it at all.
Well, these are forecasts, aren't they? And will reflect whatever the work programme is under these headings. But do you want to add something to that?
I mean, there is a list I could maybe forward on if that's helpful, but the ones we specifically mentioned, the priority investment, they're going towards supplementing the revenue budget for specific services. So, for instance, it would have gone towards the Eisteddfod. I think there's some funds coming out in 17-18 for that. Future Monmouthshire, yes. So it's going towards supplementing those schemes within the revenue budget. So, it's part of the funding for the revenue budget in 17-18.
As a member, it gives me a picture as to how the money is actually moving and the council's doing. Thank you.
So, did we decide that you would, if more information could be made available, then it should be sent to all members, I think. Well, thank you very much. Yes. Okay, then. In that case, I shall move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the Internal Audit Progress Report on Unfavourable Audit Opinions. Mr. Wathen.
Thank you, Chairman. This is one of the regular reports I bring to Audit Committee, and this is the 6-month update on the unfavourable audit opinions which we've issued in the audit work we've undertaken in line with our audit plan, and hopefully we'll give members assurances that improvements have been made when we do a follow-up. So the information is set out before you in terms of the years that we've undertaken and delivered unfavourable opinions, and 4.3 is a table of the unfavourable opinions we've issued to date. 2 tables because our opinions changed in 2006, as I'm sure members will be aware. So we now only have 1 unfavourable opinion, which is limited assurance, and our aim is to provide members and senior managers of the authority with assurance on the adequacy of the internal control environment that we're operating in and the services provided in, and that the public money is spent economically, efficiently and effectively. And we do our audit work to come to that conclusion, to give an overall opinion. The unfavourable opinions are where things need significant improvement in order to reach that kind of base level. So in 13-14 there were no unfavourable audit opinions. In 14-15 there were 6 unfavourable audit opinions which have been reported to Audit Committee previously, and we've called in respective managers in terms of Passenger Transport Unit and Monmouthshire Enterprises. In 15-16 we issued 7 audit reports with an unfavourable audit opinion, 4 of which were carried forward from previous years. And in the table in paragraph 4.6, which is page 69, top of page 69, gives a bit of an update on where we are, identifies the original audit opinion and any revised audit opinion, and whether or not that work is in progress. As members will see, there are a number which are in progress, and there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it is down to me and my team, where we have not had the resource to actually review the work that's been undertaken. The audit's been undertaken, but we haven't reviewed it properly and in totality in order for us to issue a follow-up report yet, but that is in progress. In other circumstances, managers are saying there's no point in us going into audit because to solve the problems, we need to implement a new system, and that hasn't been implemented yet. You have to give us some more time. Or we need additional resources ourselves, such as the implementation of a new manager in a particular area will help to resolve the issues which we've identified and close the gap in terms of the internal control environment. For Chepstow School, we've also invited the head teacher and her management team into Audit Committee previously, along with passenger transport and Monmouthshire enterprises, as I've already mentioned. In 2016-17, 8 reports had a limited opinion, and those are outlined in the table below. And you'll note that some progress has been made. In particular, the events review has had a second consecutive limited opinion, and that came before Audit Committee in December in a special meeting. The rest of the work is in progress or will be undertaken towards the end of Q4, which we're in now, 17-18. If not, failing that, it'll be covered in Q1 of 18-19. So the reasons why we've identified these particular reviews as unfavourable have been brought to Audit Committee's attention previously. In 4.13, the work we did on volunteering has not been brought to your attention previously, so I've outlined why we felt it was unfavourable, and those are the key aspects, the key risks which are covered, which weren't addressed. In 4.14, which is the current year, 17-18, so far we've issued 2 reports with a limited opinion, the Borough Theatre and Raglan Primary School, and I've outlined the reasons why we've identified them as unfavourable. With the Borough Theatre, slightly different to the normal process in that this was a specific request to undertake some work. It wasn't planned, so we wouldn't ordinarily issue an opinion, but the Chief Officer and the Cabinet member were keen for us to issue an opinion on the work we'd undertaken, so we did in a separate report. But because, as I say, the legal undertakings that are ongoing at the moment, I'm not in a position to report why we felt it was unfavourable to Audit Committee at this moment in time. In terms of Raglan Primary School, again, outlined the reasons why we felt it was unfavourable, key risks, mainly around the school private fund. So hopefully that gives members a flavour of where we are in terms of unfavourable audit opinions. Work is in progress to follow up the unfavourables to ensure that there is some improvement, and hopefully I can report that to you in due course back to Audit Committee. But picking up a question that was raised by members last time round, I think I gave assurance to members that I will follow up any unfavourable opinions within a 6 to 12 month period, and the question was, is that too long? Should we be looking at something to be followed up within 6 months or sooner than? That's a very good point. It's a very important point. It comes down to whether the managers have got the resources and the appropriate systems to implement their agreed actions at that particular time. We could go back and look at it within 2 months, but if nothing's been implemented, then I'll be reporting back to you the same thing, status quo. So we've got to give managers who are providing the service an opportunity to implement those recommendations, and that's the reason why we say we'll be back within 6 to 12 months to follow it up. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Questions and observations, please. Councillor Higgins.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. In relation to the school one, I take it that that's all been addressed because when things go wrong, you're usually called to book on that and explain what or explain what the situation is and what you have to do to make it correct.
Thanks, Chairman. with all our audit reports, when we do a review, we go and discuss the draft report with either the operational manager or the head teacher, and we agree what needs to be done to make those improvements. So there's in essence an action plan on every single audit report. That's agreed by the manager or the head teacher, and they've got an obligation then to address those and implement those recommendations. Picking up the point from the action list earlier on in the meeting, in schools in particular, members felt that those agreed actions weren't always implemented as quickly as they should have been. So that's something that we're looking into at the moment.
Councillor Eason.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I want to raise a point regarding 4.11, but I don't believe I can raise it in this forum at the moment. Perhaps I can have permission to raise it when we get onto the exempt papers. It's to do with the last meeting we had with Council.
Yes, but I think we should only speak about events
later on.
Under item 18, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Andrew? Okay.
Hopes that wasn't a staged exit there.
Wait for me, right?
Okay, we're still on questions and observations about the internal audit progress report. Right, I note the recommendations that we note the improvements made, or that we consider calling people in. My personal feeling is that for the most recent reports, internal audit should have a chance to get back and see what progress is made. And I note that the older ones that are in progress, well, we've had an explanation as to why that should be. Mm-hmm. So I'm proposing that we just note the report at this stage.
Yeah.
Right, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Mr. Wathen. The next item on the agenda is the strategic risk assessment, and we have Richard Jones here to introduce that. That's item 10. And I'll just note the recommendations that members use the risk assessment to consider the effectiveness of the authority's risk management arrangements, and on an ongoing basis hold the responsibility holders to account to ensure that risk is being properly managed, and that members consider the strategic risk assessment presented for the next 3 years, in particular those of relevance to the committee, scrutinise the extent to which the strategic risks facing the authority are appropriately captured. And I think we have some electronic engineering going on at the front here.
Can you just try? That's it.
Yeah.
Remember to turn on your microphone.
Okay, thank you for that. So, as the chair has helpfully outlined here, to present to you the current version of the Council's whole authority strategic risk assessment, to fulfil your role as Audit Committee to provide assurance on the adequacy of the risk management framework. And what I thought would be useful to do, particularly for some new members of the committee, and as a revision to refresh for some previous members of the committee, just give you a little bit of background in terms of how we identify strategic risks in line with our risk management policy. You'll see on Appendix 2 of the agenda a very brief summary of that risk management policy, strategic risk management policy in place. But I just want to maybe outline to you some of the key principles of it, which will be helpful in informing your scrutiny today. So the purpose of risk management, as I said, there's a strategic risk management policy and guidance in place. It outlines that risk management is the process of identifying risks, evaluating their potential consequences, and determining the most effective methods of controlling them or responding to them. So particularly within the Council, the policy sets out the purpose of risk management, And obviously, as a large public sector organisation which delivers a wide range of services, the council is exposed to a wide range of risks, and therefore effective risk management is important. So the purpose of risk management in the council is to preserve and protect the council's assets, reputation and staff, aid good management of risk and support whole authority governance, aid delivery of its outcomes internally when working with partners, improve business performance and anticipated risks in delivering improvements, avoid unnecessary liabilities, costs and failures, and shape procedures and responsibilities for implementation. So what specifically are strategic risks? And it's strategic risks that are in the strategic risk assessment today. So strategic risks are not every risk facing the council. They are risks which affect the council as a whole. Typically these will be key risks which could significantly jeopardise the council's ability to achieve its outcomes, objectives, statutory plans and or provide operational services as planned. I think what's important to mention at this point is that the presence of risk does not necessarily mean something should not be progressed. As an example, there will be occasions when the council may benefit from introducing new opportunities or adopting new innovative approaches. These may necessarily result in a degree of calculated risk that's inherent in their approach, and they need to be assessed appropriately in line with the council's risk tolerant controls as set out in the risk management policy, but they may be not sufficient enough for the proposal or project not to progress. So what does the strategic risk assessment cover? So Appendix 1 gives you the layout and the current strategic risk facing the council. Hopefully, as you'll see in that, it covers the nature of the risk, the consequences and impact with appropriate evidence, the overall risk level for the current year and also the subsequent 2 years. And Appendix 2 sets out the risk matrix used to determine the likelihood and impact of risk, therefore given the overall risk level. The planned and existing actions in place to mitigate the risks, the relevant timescales for actions and those officers responsible for delivery, and some updated information and direction of travel in terms of the risk environment and the progress on those actions. So move on to how are the strategic risks identified. A wide range of evidence is used to identify strategic risks. These include things like annual service planning process, regulatory reports, scrutiny findings, performance data. Some of those evidence bases will be scrutinised by Audit Committee throughout the year, something like the annual governance statement, regulatory report. So you will see some of those evidence sources have been used to populate the strategic risk register. The strategic risk register is just one part of the council's risk management arrangements. There's a variety of arrangements in place where risks are managed, and the pyramid, if you want a better word, on the right-hand side shows you some of those processes. So through team service plans where individual services have a risk register in place to manage risks specifically to their service, our business continuity arrangements, our emergency planning, through insurance and finance, through health and safety, and through individual project and programme management arrangements. The strategic risk assessment only covers high and medium level strategic risks. Lower level operational strategic risks are not registered unless they're projected to escalate to a higher level in 3 years, and those risks are managed through the service plans and arrangements shown on screen. So responsibility for managing strategic risks. Ultimately, everyone in the council has a responsibility, employees and councils, for ensuring there's good levels of internal control and risk management. The strategic risk management policy sets out some specific officer and groups of officers who have responsibility, so people like the senior leadership team, heads of service, etc. Elected members hold a responsibility to oversee the control of strategic risks. Cabinet has an executive responsibility to assess the strategic risk log at least annually. An audit committee, as I mentioned at the start, has a responsibility around ensuring the risk management framework is in place. So updates to strategic risk and further information. Clearly, the risk environment isn't static. There's new evidence and information coming to light all the time that needs to be reflected. So the strategic risk register is a living document which is regularly updated and reviewed, and that is available on the council's internet hub for members to use at any time. As I mentioned, it will be signed off by Cabinet on an annual basis, and it can also be examined by Select Committee at any point in the year at the determination of the Chair and the committee members. And we've encouraged previously the committees to access the live risk log to inform their work. And as I mentioned, it's updated in line with the full risk management policy, which is available on the intranet. So that's some background I wanted to give the committee today, just to inform your role, particularly for new members who may not have received the strategic risk assessment before, or new members of the committee. Just bringing specifically onto the report in front of you today, as I mentioned, the structure of Appendix 1 and what it sets out. Some of the risks in there have been updated and amended based on the latest available evidence, and you'll see that some of those are marked as revised, and some of those are marked as new, where new risks have been identified as needing to be on the strategic risk register. The table after the risk register sets out those risks that have been removed from the register, where there's evidence that the risk level has been lowered. However, some of those may still have an element of risk that we monitored through team service plans. And I'm happy to take any questions the committee may have on the risk management process and the strategic risk assessment itself, particularly those risks where you'll have a role as a committee, and you'll see the Audit Committee as a named select committee in the paper. Clearly there's a lot of detail covered across a range of services. I may not be able to answer all that detail, so if there's any specific points we can look to get a response back to the committee if required. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you. For the benefit of the live stream, are we switching back to the regular... that's it? Right, okay, good. Thank you for that. After consideration by Audit Committee, this paper will go to Cabinet, I believe, so Committee is providing an endorsement to the information presented, just to note that. Just a personal observation from me. I'm impressed by the presentation of the information and the clarity in the way it's been presented. I've seen a lot worse over the years here and elsewhere. But questions and observations from committee members, please. Councillor Smith, yes.
It's not a criticism at all. No, it is. The presentation has been clear and it's good. When I was reading through, under the point 9 of the revised thing, there's a reference there, and okay, you're right in what you're saying, Mr. Jones. Work closely with our secondary schools to ensure they're prepared for the new examinations, but I'm equally concerned that we work closely with our primary schools and our reception, because it's that where you put the bed there, and would hate to think that people thought, yeah, the extra goes into secondary. That foundation is so important. So, no, it's interesting. I know the only high one is the last one. Yeah, which I would have expected.
That may change, obviously.
That may change. Thank you.
Any other questions or observations from members of the committee? I think it's right that we should satisfy ourselves that that the process of identifying risk and so on is being documented. Obviously, we can go round and round the houses on specific issues. I was quite interested in which particular aspects of things got prominence, and I understand this is a hierarchical thing that builds up through all the levels of organisation in the authority. Unless you want to add something to that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Chair. I think as I went through my presentation, you saw some of those arrangements that were in place in the Council to manage risks, and the strategic risk assessment draws upon that evidence as set out and guided by the policy in order to bring together some of those risks of particular strategic importance that may threaten delivery of our outcomes, etc., as defined by definition of risk management. So through those processes, it's hoped and it's planned that the strategic risks are appropriately captured on this risk register. As I said, the environment can change, evidence can change, and it's important that we look at these things on an ongoing basis. And also to pick up your point in terms of potentially the role this plays in terms of informing the committee on the wider work of the council and the risks it faces. I'd encourage this committee as well to continue to use that to inform your work, and if there's anything of particular interest that may warrant on your work programme or particular note for select committees through the chairs to look at, then please use it for that purpose as well, if it would be helpful to you.
Thank you. So we've got the risks identified, and we've got the proposed mitigations there in the right-hand columns, and we're going to find out eventually how those proposed mitigations worked out.
Yeah, say, when your evidence committee will be assessed, at the moment, it's at least an annual report through to you, which is updating on those risks. The actions are there set for the responsibility holders to deliver within those timeframes, and then assess back against whether that's suitably mitigated the risk levels. Some of those risks obviously are very complicated and will have multiple factors in terms of which impact on them. So no one action alone may impact on the level, but a combination of that and the evidence available may determine that the risk has been mitigated or at least lowered. As you'll see for some of the ones in the table at the bottom where we've lowered the risk level and they've come off the strategic risk register.
Thank you. Well, if the committee is generally satisfied, thank you very much. I shall move on then to the next item, which is now going to be item 12, the joint progress document between. This comes directly out of the external auditing process, which has been completed, and there's matters arising from that. So I'm going to hand over to Terry Lewis of the Welsh Audit Office, just to introduce the paper and possibly ask for some response from the authority afterwards. Terry.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'll just briefly run through this document. As has been explained, it is in relation to the 2016-17 accounts that we've just audited. It's a document that we jointly prepare with the Council's officers, if you like, just to track actions and issues arising out of the audit. And it falls into three sort of main sections. The first area is issues that were reported to you in the financial statements report when we signed off the accounts back towards the end of September. So what it does is just sort of identifies each of those issues that were in that report. It records a response in terms of action agreed and how that is going to progress going forward. So it tracks each of those actions. So you will have seen each of those before. They're mostly of a technical nature that were covered in the financial statements report. The next section then covers other issues that weren't important enough to be covered in the financial statements report, but nevertheless that things that we identified as part of our audit. So we've just highlighted those there. There are a couple of things in terms of those are set out in Exhibit 2 around accumulated absences, where we did some work around sort of sampling leave entitlements, etc., and it highlighted a few errors. So it's sort of saying probably an area you need to have a look at. It's not a major thing in terms of the audit, but nevertheless something that needs to be addressed. And then there was some other areas around IT. We'd look at some of the IT systems each year in terms of the integrity of some of those, how people access them, etc. So we identified a couple of things there from that work. So we flagged that in that section, and those are being taken forward as agreed actions as well. And there was one further action then in the third exhibit, which is a carried forward issue from a few years ago that just sort of continues to occur, which is the legal title of Osbaston School, which is still to be resolved, which again is on the action list to be dealt with. So overall, it's just a summary of all those issues that have arisen. Actions have been agreed to address each of them. It's a joint report. It's a means of just tracking that everything's being implemented. No major issues or concerns, really. Happy to take any questions.
Just whether, because the agreed actions, so I'll just ask whether Jonathan has anything to add.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, as Terry's mentioned, this was a joint report between WAO and finance colleagues. We were heavily involved in coming up with a lot of these recommendations. I think it's important to note that an unqualified audit opinion was given on the 2016-17 accounts, and the issues listed here in this report constitute refinements that are needed to be made during 2017-18 to ensure that the next closure process runs smoothly for both Monmouthshire and WAO. A large number of these recommendations, they relate to fixed assets, which isn't surprising given that it forms the largest part of our asset base as an authority. and the accounting arrangements around fixed assets are probably the most complex of them all. So I think the conclusion for us as a section is that we welcome the recommendations that have been brought forward. Work has been ongoing since the last closure process to make sure that arrangements are put in place to implement these in preparation for the next accounts closure at the end of March.
Thank you. Questions and observations, please. Councillor Easton.
Thank you, Chair. This is the 2016-2017 report, and a lot of the points you're making I've made are either being actioned or have been actioned. But I come to one area, which is the SRS, the computer system which we operate on, although it's a standalone company in some respects. There are questions in there which backup tapes, for example, are not stored in the same industrial estate on Blenavon. I thought that the system that was being brought in for SRS, there would be a triangulation of sites across Wales where backup systems would be in place to remove that potential loss. I presume I'm wrong. So what action has been taken to ensure that the security of data and not what in SRS will be corrected? It says January 2018, but does it give an indication it hasn't been done yet? Just the SRS, data protection, and am I right that there was supposed to be 3 links across Wales where they'd linked information together?
Unfortunately, Sian Hayward was going to come along today to answer any questions on this on these items. So I don't think I'd be able to give you any definitive answer on the SRS items.
Perhaps you could answer it then sometime.
Perhaps you could ask Sian what her response would be to such a question and let us know. Councillor Smith.
I've got the same question as Tony. I was very surprised that the tapes were still held on site there. That's so basic. Thank you.
Any other questions or observations on the joint progress report? If not, we'll note the report, and I shall move on to the next item on the agenda. Actually covers 2 areas. The next item on the agenda is the accounts of the Welsh Church Act Fund and the Monmouthshire Farm School Endowment Trust. And then subsequent to that, we've got the ISA 260s or equivalents. I believe that the Welsh Church Act Fund is formally audited, whereas the Farm School Endowment Trust has a thing called an independent examination, but it amounts to the to Welsh Audit Office auditing the accounts of both organisations. So we've got the accounts there of the Welsh Church Act Fund. Is there any need to, well, is there someone who would introduce those briefly, I hope, because they're quite long?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's me again. We have both the Welsh Church Fund and Mon Farm accounts in the report. These are required to be submitted to the Charities Commission by the end of January. So they come to this committee for endorsement prior to sign off by our Section 151 officer, and subsequently then they're submitted to the Commission. In terms of the audit of both, there was an unqualified audit opinion on the Welsh Church Fund accounts, and as the Chair correctly stated, it was an examination only for the Mon Farms accounts, which produced what was called an unqualified examiner's report being issued. I'm not intending to go through any of the accounts in detail, so I'm happy to answer any questions in conjunction with Dave Jarrett, who's come along on the Welsh Church Fund and Mon Farms.
Over to members then.
They're fairly straightforward, and for me, I'm prepared to accept them, Chairman.
It was nice to see they're giving out more grants through which without the County Council and the Welsh Church Act Fund. That was better. There was a question somewhere, Chairman.
Take your microphone.
It is off. Sorry. I can't find what I wanted to ask, Chairman. With these reports, they are heavy going when you get to the end of them. When I say heavy going, but it's very interesting to know where the monies are actually located and what their holdings are, and also the difference between a tangible asset, was it, and something else asset, a community asset. One was liable to tax and the other. So it's not the best bedtime story, Chairman, but it's illuminating.
Well, my observation on the Wealth Church Act fund was that the fund seems to be healthy financially, and the same for the Monmouthshire Farm School Endowment Trust, and we've got unqualified audits on both. So I feel the committee should really be satisfied, unless there are specific questions that you have. Councillor East.
Just one question of possible accuracy or inaccuracy, I'm not quite sure. I've declared interest on the Mon Farm Trust, but in the Mon Farm Trust trustees, officers and advisors, it shows Paul Matthews as the acting monitor officer. It shows Robert Tranter as head of legal services. I'm not sure, but I think that Robert Tranter is the secretary, not Paul Matthews. Am I correct? Oh, if I'm wrong, somebody needs to put right in that, that's all.
Sorry, Councillor, could I ask which page?
If you go to the heading page of the Mon Farm Trust, trustees, officers and advisors, it's got the members and everything down there. But it's also got Paul Matthews as acting monitor. Page 145 of the pack, but 153 is it? Well, essentially, is Paul Matthews the secretary of the Mon Farm Trust, or is Robert Tranter, or if Paul Matthews is, his title is wrong? What is correct? Because it's got to be correct.
Okay, I think I'll look to clarify that with the relevant officers.
It needs to be correct, doesn't it?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that. Right. Well, if there are no further questions or observations, then on the actual accounts, I think we will probably just note the ISA 260 reports. I don't think there's anything further to say about those, unless anyone else wants to chip in on that. Okay, I'll move on then. I'll move on then to the forward work programme. I think we need a bit more detail in there. It's looking
it's thin, isn't it?
It's looking a bit thin. Thin was my word as well. The committee does a lot of work, a lot of detailed papers, and I know that people are scheming away in the background to provide us with more things to look at between now and the end of the year. But if possible, the forward work plan could be filled in a bit more, I'd be grateful. Yes, Andrew.
Yes, Chairman, I'll take responsibility for that. We kind of update it on an annual basis. Comes to beginning of the year and we update it for the full year. So I'll liaise with colleagues to make sure that it's a fuller programme for Audit Committee moving forward and it's populated for the next time round.
Thank you. I know it does tend to get shorter towards the end of the financial year because we can't really have a programme until we've formally got a new committee. But yes, Councillor Smith.
Is it proposed that the Abergavenny Theatre report will come eventually to audit? At the moment you've got your legal block, but what proposal is there?
Chairman, it depends on what the legal people say. If they're happy for me to present my findings, then I can do so. I'll clarify with them to see what the situation is.
I think it's particularly relevant at the moment, looking at the alternative delivery model and implications and such like. It's important.
Well, I think we'd expect the Chief Internal Auditor to give us some kind of resolution of that particular issue, even if some of the details have to be withheld for legal reasons. Right, thank you. The date and time of the next meeting will be 8th of March at 2 p.m. The next item on the agenda is to consider whether to exclude the press and public from the meeting during consideration of the next item of business. The papers have been presented to you. I'll treat that as passed. So we now turn off the live streaming, don't we?